one of the Saturday nights of August, at least 5% of the Israeli population marched together for economic change. Translate that to 15 million Americans marching on the same night. Okay, the power of this movement was incredible. Who knows whether it will be revived again this year as the weather warms up or not. But one of the leaders said in their press conference announcing their goals, she said, we demand quality education for all. And then she said, religious and secular, Jewish and Arab, everyone. That was a statement that everyone in the state of Israel, everyone means all of us. It doesn't just mean the Jews. It doesn't just mean the Arabs. Israeli is not a synonym for Jew. It is a synonym for the citizens of this country. So we have to achieve that. And the third thing is, and I really think it's the keystone of the other two, is that we have to at least do everything that we can to end the occupation, to create a two-state solution. Because just as Ben-Gurion said in 1949 and Shapiro said in 1967, out of three potential values which the state of Israel can realize, to have a Jewish majority, a democracy, and the whole land of Israel, in the real world, you have to choose two of those to achieve. In the real world, you make choices between which of your values are more important. You don't get to realize them all. And in the real world, if you keep the whole land, you either don't have a democracy or you don't have a Jewish state. So I want to reverse the usual paradigm that you hear. Usually, when people talk about giving up the West Bank, it's in terms of Israel sacrificing land for peace, and peace is the end. Now, believe me, I think that peace is a very, very, very important goal. However, and by the way, I also feel historical connection to that land. I can be moved by being in Hebron or being in Shiloh and so forth. However, I would argue that in order to preserve Israel as a democracy and as a flourishing state, we need to cease ruling the West Bank. In order to reestablish the rule of law, in order to have defined boundaries, in order to know who is the governed, by whose consent the country will be governed, we need to essentially carry out the idea of dividing the land that was at the root of creating the state in 1948. And in order to do that safely, we need a peace agreement. The only way that we can do that safely and securely is through a peace agreement. Therefore, peace is also the means for preserving a democratic Israel. And so I just want to finish with one last point, and that is, so what's your role in all this? It's very interesting. Am I just being academic here? Okay, look, to some extent, you know, this is my responsibility, my kids' responsibility, my neighbor's responsibility. We're there, we're the citizens. However, I would propose that a new and different definition of the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel is needed. It is, again, and here I'm again agreeing with Tal, we have to accept, you know what, we did it. We created a sovereign state. It's a pretty strong state. It's a pretty flourishing state. The revolution took place 64 years ago. To see Israel as a shtetl surrounded by Islamic Cossacks is profoundly ahistorical and anti-Zionist. It is not to accept the victory of Zionism. So we have to get beyond siege Zionism, supporting Israel as about to be wiped out. So my model, which I would propose, is this. Israel gives diaspora Jews the lab conditions of what it's like when the public space is Jewish, when you can celebrate a holiday without wondering what the majority thinks because you are the majority, where everything from the language in the discotheques to the beauty images to the religion that is discussed and that sometimes takes too much role in public life, and we argue about whether that's good or not, is Jewish. You come to Israel, you can understand you are in a different reality where you're part of the majority. And I think that most Jews who visit Israel find that bracing and exciting, and it gives them a different sense of what it means to be Jewish. What you can do as the diaspora is to remind Israel of the values that became important to us as Jews because we have been a minority. What it is like to be a stranger in Egypt or in France or in Germany or on the Lower East Side, and why that created among Jews a commitment to the rights of the other. And so I will finish with a story, as I started. There's a story of a Jew who was a member of a Soviet delegation that had a press conference in a Western country during the Cold War, and the Jew's job on the team, obviously, was to give the anti-Zionist speech. And you all know it, so I won't try to repeat it. But anyway, after the press conference, a journalist comes up to him and grabs him by the sleeves and says, listen, you're Jewish. You must have your own opinion on this. And the Jew hesitates for a moment, and he says, "You know, I do, but I don't agree with it." And I got no idea what most of you think, but I think there's a lot of American Jews who have an opinion on these issues and somehow think it's not kosher to agree with themselves on it. And I think that it's important to express those opinions as part of a real dialogue between the members of our tribe in the diaspora and in Israel, that if you support strengthening democracy in Israel and the diplomatic efforts that at least increase the chances of reaching peace, that you should say so out loud. Israel matters desperately to me. I want it to flourish. And the way to get there, this is my core belief as a journalist and a historian, is not to blind ourselves to problems, but to talk about them and to work together to preserve and improve a democratic Jewish state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gershom. So I will field questions here for you, and if more come up along the way, we'll take them too. First question: how can Israel create a two-state solution if the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution?
If you read the President Abbas's request for membership in the UN, he's asking for recognition of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. In an interview on Israel's Channel 2 in, I believe, November, dates are in my computer, I can check, he said, "We blew it in 47, we should have accepted the partition plan." I have sat in meetings with Palestinian government officials and with former commanders of Palestinian units in Ramallah and Bethlehem, and I've heard a guy with war wounds across his face from firefights with Israelis earlier in his life pound on the table and say, "Our program is a two-state solution." That doesn't mean we're at the point of agreement or that those people are any more a unanimous voice in their community than those of us in Israel who support a two-state solution are a unanimous voice in our community. However, I remember the early 80s. I made Aliyah in 77. I remember the late 70s and the early 80s, where either on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side to support a two-state solution was considered treasonous. And on both sides today, the polls show that that's the solution, or I don't want to use the word solution, the arrangement that most, because I don't think in the real world you ever get to a point where you've solved everything. You get to better and worse arrangements. That's the arrangement that has the strongest support on both sides. It is also true, and this is why we need negotiators, and this is why negotiating is tough, that the view on each side of what a two-state agreement entails, the borderlines, the control of holy places, how to deal with the refugee issue, a whole long list of really tough stuff, that there's disagreements on that. It's also true that in the 19 years since Oslo, we have not reached an agreement on those issues, but in the sporadic periods where there were serious negotiations, the distance between the two sides shrunk, and it shrunk because of each side slowly giving up some of their original claims. In the Abbas-Olmert negotiations, the best reported version of the Abbas-Olmert negotiations in 2008, for instance, both sides agreed to the idea that what's known as the Holy Base in the Old City of Jerusalem and the holy spots around it would be ruled by some sort of international committee, and that neither side would have sovereignty. That's a huge concession on the deepest psychological level from both sides. Then naturally they disagreed about what exactly was the Holy Basin and what was in it and who exactly would be on the committee. Okay, you know what? When you've gotten to that point, you're doing better. If those negotiations had continued, if Mr. Olmert hadn't been indicted for everything, and if his successor had not refused to go back to the negotiations where they left off, we might be in agreement today. Yes, there's a responsibility on the Palestinian side. Yes, there's times that they're obdurate. And yes, there's times that our leaders are also intransigent and obdurate. The problem is not that there's one side that wants to make peace and there's one side that doesn't. The problem is each side needing to work a little harder to get there.
What role did security issues play in government decisions about the settlements? Didn't Jordan still lay claim to the West Bank, and didn't Israel expect to negotiate new boundaries with Jordan, not with the Palestinians?
Okay, who Israel was trying to negotiate both with Palestinians and with Jordanians in secret immediately after the war. There's a new book coming out. I can't remember the name of it, but the author's name is Avi Raz, which covers the secret negotiations under the Eshkol government between 67 and Eshkol's death at the beginning of 69. So in terms of negotiations that were going on with both groups, there was a whole argument in the Israeli government whether it was better to negotiate with the Palestinians or negotiate with the Jordanians. But the bottom line is, yes, there were some Israeli officials who thought that settlements added to security. They were living in the past. They were living in the pre-state era where outlying kibbutzim had been the frontline fortresses in the War of Independence. In 1973, however, when war broke out on the Syrian front on Yom Kippur, the Israeli Defense Forces had to devote critically needed resources to evacuating the settlements in the Golan before the Syrian troops reached them, rather than to fighting the Syrians. The idea of settlements as providing security is a classic example of thinking in terms of a national movement and not as a state. Security is provided to us by the army, and the army's need to provide security to Israeli settlements in occupied territories is a drain on it. When Israeli soldiers have to take time off from their other duties, and believe me, I've seen this from all sorts of directions. This is what goes on. You get a week or 2 weeks a year out of your usual duties to go off and guard a settlement. That is a drain on Israeli security. When you build the fence to take in settlements and it's twice as long and takes twice as long to build because you're looping around settlements, that's a drain on Israeli security. When you are negotiating and you're trying to figure out how to gerrymander the border in a way that looks worse than a Texas congressional district in order to take in some outlying settlement and keep it in the state of Israel, you're creating a tendril of Israeli land that will be more difficult to create security for than the original boundary. Settlements today, there's a lot of things that I'll tell you, all sorts of complex things, and I'll disagree with myself the moment after I say something, but here I can be clear. Settlements do not contribute to security. The idea that settlements contributed to security was definitely there. I find it in countless documents from 1967, but it was an anachronistic conception. It was like building a cavalry with horses in 1967. It was simply an outdated idea of people who had really achieved incredible, amazing things for which I deeply respect them in their youth, and they were using the same methods 20 years later, and it was out of date.